So, how do we know if a command that was given in Scripture is for us for today? Now, one of the ways that most pastors and theologians try to bridge that gap is say if something is repeated in both in the Old and New Testament, then it is a command that we are supposed to follow. And while that may be a good start, I don't think it's the full picture. There's a few principles that we need to keep in mind, beginning in Ephesians 2:15, when Paul says that he, Jesus, made of no effect the law consisting of commands and expressed in regulations. Paul also says in Galatians 3, the law then, which brought about the trespass, was our guardian until Christ, so that we could be justified by faith. But since that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. So what Paul is getting at here is that the law that was given by God wasn't unto itself. God didn't give a bunch of regulations and commands because he thought it would be a good idea. Rather, those regulations and commands were to guard us and keep us unto faith in Jesus Christ. An easier way of thinking about this is how you discipline and raise a child. So, for example, in the future, I'm going to have to establish rules and boundaries for my son in those things that he can and cannot do. And let's say, hypothetically, that one of them is you cannot have any caffeine or soda after 4 p.m. And if he decides to disobey that rule, there are going to be consequences for it. Now, my hope as a father is that that rule would instill in him an understanding that what we put into our bodies matters. If you drink caffeine at a certain point, you're not going to get a good night's rest. I want him to learn about moderation, that there are times to consume things and times that you shouldn't consume those things. But until he comes to those understandings, that rule is established to keep him and to guard him. It is a proclivity of the human heart not to understand the heart of the law, but rather have either a blind adherence to it or to resent and reject it. So my biggest fear would be a son who grows up to hate me and reject me because I told him no caffeine after 4 p.m. because I was so unloving and constricting. Or a son that grows up to berate people with a religious ferocity because they do drink those things after 4 p.m. In either of those cases, there's a lack of understanding of what that rule was trying to accomplish and guard him for. And the problem is we approach the scriptures in the same way. We look for the commands and the regulations rather than Christ, because that's who the law was guarding us for. So there are definitely things in scripture that we ought to do. It's black and white. It's been repeated in the Old Testament and New Testament. There are things that we're not entirely sure if it was for specific people or universally within the church. And even today, there are churches that have convictions of their own in addition to what's in Scripture on how they ought to serve God. But really, in all of these things, it's not so much about what commands and regulations Scripture gives us, but rather what those commands and regulations are unto. And ultimately, that needs to be the guiding principle in everything that we do, which sometimes means that we need to obey when we don't understand. But it's that principle that leads us into the commands we should follow.